February 15th, 1942, Singapore. The air reeked of smoke and burning oil, thick with the metallic tang of fear and exhaustion. Outside the command room, the distant rumble of artillery had ceased. That silence was worse than the guns. Inside, British officers crowded around maps of Malaya, their eyes tracing red circles creeping south like blood spreading through water. For 2 centuries, the British Empire had never surrendered an entire army. Not like this, not to an Asian power. Yet here they were. Lieutenant General Arthur Percival, head bowed beneath the weight of history, carried a white flag into a factory building. 80,000 men would surrender that day, the largest capitulation in British military history. Singapore, the so-called Gibraltar of the East, was supposed to be impregnable. Its 15-inch naval guns loomed over the coast, bunkers carved into rock, barbed wire bristling like teeth. For 2 decades, British planners had assured themselves that this fortress could withstand any assault from the sea. But the Japanese didn't come from the sea. They came through the jungle. By the final days, the streets trembled under the approach of unseen tanks. Fires crackled in the Chinese quarter. Water rationing had begun. Hospitals overflowed. Civilians crowded the docks, desperate to flee. And inside the command bunkers, officers stared at reports they couldn't believe. How could 30,000 Japanese soldiers, many on bicycles, lightly equipped, push back an army nearly 3 times their size? How could a fortress designed to withstand the world fall in just 7 days? The answers were there all along. The British just hadn't wanted to see them.
When Japan struck Pearl Harbor in December 1941, British command in Singapore was calm. Reassurances flowed like a mantra. The Japanese are poorly equipped. Their planes are copies. Their tanks are obsolete. Their soldiers lack discipline. Even Churchill called Singapore a fortress, a bastion of imperial might. The Royal Navy sent the HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse to intimidate any Japanese advance. But on December 10th, both ships were sunk off the Malayan coast by Japanese aircraft. 90 minutes was all it took to shatter the illusion of naval supremacy. Yet the British command still clung to hope. Singapore had 80,000 defenders, more than twice the Japanese numbers. Surely the jungle would slow them. Surely the rivers and terrain would halt their advance. Surely the Japanese would need months to prepare. But the Japanese moved faster than anyone predicted. They captured airfields, bypassed defensive lines, and used bicycles to advance through terrain considered impassable. Their strategy was speed and momentum. Logistics and caution were for their opponents. By early February, the Japanese had reached the Johor Strait, the last barrier separating them from Singapore Island. 1 kilometer of water, one final line of defense. On paper, it should have been enough. But the numbers and the plans were meaningless against the reality. Singapore's reservoirs were insufficient for the population's needs. Water rationing was imminent. Ammunition, though stored in vast coastal bunkers, was largely useless for the infantry fighting inland. Anti-aircraft rounds and small arms were running critically low. Air superiority was lost. Of the RAF's 158 aircraft in the region, fewer than 30 remained operational. The defenders themselves were spread thin. 80,000 men sounded formidable, but the perimeter of Singapore stretched 70 miles. That was barely 100 men per mile if evenly distributed, and they were far from evenly positioned. Most troops were stationed along the southern coast, expecting a naval assault that would never come. In the northwest, where the Japanese actually advanced, defense was largely in the hands of inexperienced Indian and Malay units, some with mere weeks of training. When the Japanese crossed the Johor Strait on the night of February 8th, they struck precisely where the British were weakest. Lieutenant General Percival, who had taken command in May 1941, inherited a defensive plan built on outdated assumptions. Reinforcements were requested, but London sent only 2 inexperienced Indian brigades and an understrength British division, troops unfamiliar with jungle warfare and without tanks. The Japanese, meanwhile, ignored assumptions entirely. Their intelligence had underestimated Singapore's defenders, but they exploited the chaos. They infiltrated at night, bypassed strongpoints, and struck where least expected. They lived off captured supplies, abandoned broken vehicles, and pressed forward with a relentless momentum. While British commanders waited for reports and reinforcements, the Japanese were already behind them, consolidating every advantage. By early February 1942, the situation in Singapore was descending into chaos. The city was a powder keg of fear, scarcity, and desperation. Civilians crowded the streets, clutching whatever belongings they could carry, desperate to board the last ships out of the island. Hospitals overflowed with wounded soldiers and frightened civilians alike, their staff exhausted and supplies running dangerously low. Fires raged in residential and commercial districts, adding smoke and confusion to the already suffocating atmosphere. Inside the command bunkers, Percival faced reports he could barely comprehend. The Northwest Front had collapsed. Japanese forces were now engaging in combat within the suburbs. Water reservoirs had been compromised. Ammunition was critically low. Troops were scattered and disorganized. The realization struck hard. The fortress of Singapore, a symbol of British invincibility, was crumbling not due to a single catastrophic battle, but due to a cascade of failed assumptions, poor preparation, and the relentless ingenuity of the Japanese advance. Percival called an emergency staff meeting at Fort Canning on the morning of February 15th. 3 options lay before them: a counterattack to recapture the reservoirs, consolidating forces into a tight defensive perimeter within the city, or surrender. Each option had devastating consequences. A counterattack was impossible. The forces needed simply did not exist. A house-to-house defense would have trapped over 1 million civilians inside a shrinking combat zone, turning Singapore into a humanitarian catastrophe akin to Stalingrad. Surrender, though unthinkable for British pride, was the only viable choice if further bloodshed was to be avoided. At 5:15 p.m., Percival walked into the Ford factory in Bukit Timah. Across from him sat General Tomoyuki Yamashita, the Japanese commander. The meeting lasted an hour, a tense standoff between exhaustion and strategy. Yamashita demanded unconditional surrender. Percival, knowing the impossibility of a successful counterattack, the lack of reserves, and the absence of viable supply lines, signed the papers. 80,000 men, British, Australian, and Indian, became prisoners of war. The surrender sent shockwaves through London. Churchill called it the worst disaster and the largest capitulation in British history. But the catastrophe was not merely military, it was psychological. For over 2 centuries, the British Empire had operated on a premise of superiority in arms, organization, and will. The fall of Singapore shattered that belief. If Britain could not defend its prize fortress, what of India, Burma, or Australia? The illusion of invincibility was gone. In Tokyo, the victory was celebrated as proof of Japanese supremacy. Propaganda reels depicted triumphant soldiers and the collapse of colonial rule. Posters declared the beginning of the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, Japan's vision of an empire free from Western domination. Across Southeast Asia, Singapore's fall emboldened Japanese advances into Burma, the Philippines, and New Guinea. For the prisoners, however, the war had only just begun. The 80,000 men marched into captivity, forced to endure the brutal conditions of the Burma Railway, labor camps, and disease. Over a quarter of them would never return home. Strategically and tactically, the fall of Singapore became a case study in failure. Military academies studied the collapse for decades. The lessons were written in blood. Assumptions are not intelligence. Fortifications do not guarantee safety. Superiority on paper does not ensure success, and enemies who do not conform to your expectations are often the most dangerous. Singapore fell because it was prepared for the last war, not the next. It was a fortress designed to fight against a naval assault, not a jungle campaign. Confidence turned into complacency, complacency into catastrophe. The strongest walls can become traps when they face the wrong direction, and the British Empire learned that lesson at the cost of thousands of lives. The surrender of Singapore was not only a military disaster, it was a human tragedy of unimaginable scale. For the soldiers, the collapse meant the beginning of unimaginable suffering. Tens of thousands of British, Australian, and Indian troops were now prisoners of war. They would endure forced marches through sweltering jungles, brutal labor on the infamous Burma Railway, starvation, disease, and relentless psychological torment. The conditions were so severe that over a quarter of them would never see home again. The horrors of captivity would haunt survivors for the rest of their lives, and the shadow of that loss shaped military thinking for decades. Civilians, too, faced a grim reality. The city's residents, who had trusted British assurances of protection, found themselves at the mercy of both the advancing Japanese army and the breakdown of local infrastructure. Food shortages became acute. Hospitals ran out of supplies, clean water was scarce. Looting, panic, and fear permeated every street. Singapore, once the jewel of the British Empire in Asia, had become a city teetering on the edge of chaos.
Yet the disaster was not merely the result of bad luck or brave soldiers being overwhelmed by a numerically superior foe. It was structural, born from flawed planning and false assumptions that had calcified over decades. British defenses, designed in the 1920s and 1930s, focused entirely on threats from the sea. The 15-inch coastal guns, with armor-piercing shells meant for battleships, could barely target infantry across the Johor Strait. Ammunition for land defense was critically low. Air support, once thought to provide a safety net, had been all but destroyed by Japanese Zeros, leaving the defenders exposed and powerless. Perhaps most damning was the failure of intelligence and imagination. British planners assumed that modern armies could not traverse the Malayan jungle with speed or effectiveness. They assumed that the Japanese were technologically inferior, poorly trained, and incapable of disciplined offensive operations. They assumed European rules of warfare applied universally. Each of these assumptions was proven catastrophically wrong. Japanese forces moved light, fast, and with relentless ingenuity. They infiltrated at night, bypassed obstacles, and utilized captured supplies. Bicycles replaced trucks. Rivers, once thought impassable, became conduits for rapid assault. At the same time, Singapore's command structure was fragmented. The Army, Navy, Air Force, and civil administration operated under separate authorities, each hesitant to challenge the other or make independent decisions. Requests for reinforcements went unanswered, partly due to the global distraction of the war elsewhere, partially due to disbelief that an inferior enemy could succeed. Orders arrived too late, and when they did, they could not be executed. Coordination collapsed. And underpinning it all was the psychological cost of arrogance and colonial assumptions. For generations, British officers had been taught that discipline, European military science, and the might of the Royal Navy guaranteed supremacy. Colonial subjects were expected to depend entirely on British protection. The fall of Singapore shattered that worldview. If the so-called Gibraltar of the East could fall in 7 days, what hope remained for the wider empire? Confidence gave way to disbelief, and disbelief turned into fear. Japan, by contrast, used every psychological advantage at their disposal. Their rapid advance, the unpredictability of their tactics, and the fear they inspired accelerated the collapse of morale among defenders and civilians alike. But the time Percival signed the surrender papers at the Ford factory, Singapore was more than a military loss. It was a psychological defeat that reverberated across the Pacific. In London, the news struck like a thunderbolt. Churchill's declaration of the largest surrender in British military history was accurate, but it was the implications beyond the battlefield that resonated most. Britain's aura of invincibility had been shattered. The empire's most precious outposts had fallen, not to overwhelming force alone, but to a combination of underestimation, flawed assumptions, and unpreparedness. Allies and adversaries alike reevaluated the balance of power in Southeast Asia. Lessons were harsh and indelible. Military strategists learned that fortifications alone do not guarantee safety. Planning for the previous war is a recipe for disaster. Underestimating an opponent because of cultural bias or assumptions about capability is fatal. And most importantly, adaptability, speed, and psychological resilience can outweigh numerical or technological superiority. For the men and women trapped on Singapore, the collapse was a baptism by fire, a brutal lesson in survival and the cost of hubris and in the realities of modern warfare. The city had fallen, but the story of Singapore became a cautionary tale, studied in military academies from Sandhurst to West Point for decades to come.
It was a catastrophe that could have been avoided if assumptions had been challenged, if preparation had matched reality, and if pride had not blinded judgment. Yet history remembered not just the failure, but the lessons it left behind. Singapore fell because it was designed to fight the wrong war, against the wrong enemy, in the wrong way. Confidence became complacency. Complacency became catastrophe. And the empire paid the price in lives, credibility, and the shattering of an illusion. The fall of Singapore did not just shake the British Empire. It reshaped the strategic landscape of the entire Asia-Pacific region. Allied commanders, once confident that the empire's garrisons and naval power could hold any line, were forced to confront a new reality. The Japanese were a capable, adaptive, and highly motivated adversary, capable of outthinking and outmaneuvering much larger forces. The psychological shock reverberated far beyond the island itself. Australia, New Zealand, and India suddenly realized that the protective umbrella of Britain was not infallible. They were vulnerable, and the war in the Pacific would be far longer and bloodier than previously imagined. The surrender also emboldened Japanese ambitions. The victory became a propaganda tool, portrayed as proof that Western colonial powers were weak, decadent, and beatable. Across occupied Asia, from Malaya to the Philippines, the narrative of Japanese superiority spread rapidly. The Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, Japan's vision of a region free from Western influence, seemed achievable, if only temporarily. Japanese victories accelerated their advance across Southeast Asia, fueling a belief in their invincibility. Yet beneath the surface, the Japanese themselves were stretched thin, reliant on speed and improvisation to maintain momentum, highlighting both the brilliance and fragility of their strategy. For the Allies, Singapore became a symbol of both failure and a harsh, necessary education. Military academies worldwide dissected the campaign, not to assign blame, but to codify the lessons learned. Singapore proved that overconfidence, poor intelligence, inflexible strategy, and underestimation of the enemy could undo centuries of planning and tens of thousands of soldiers' lives in a matter of days. Fortifications, numbers, and prior reputation could not compensate for the failure to adapt to the realities of modern warfare. The human cost remained staggering. The 80,000 troops who surrendered were subjected to brutal captivity under Japanese control. Prisoner of war camps, forced labor, starvation, and disease claimed the lives of thousands. The building of the Burma Railway alone would take the lives of over 12,000 Allied prisoners, leaving survivors with physical and psychological scars that endured long after the war. Civilians faced deprivation, displacement, and trauma, their lives irreversibly altered by a collapse that could have been anticipated if planners had accounted for the unpredictable and unconventional tactics of the enemy. Politically, the fall of Singapore forced Britain to rethink imperial assumptions. The myth of invulnerability that had sustained the empire for 2 centuries was broken. Leaders could no longer rely solely on naval supremacy, colonial hierarchies, or the assumption that European armies were inherently superior to those of Asia. The empire's post-war trajectory would be defined in part by the recognition that colonial subjects were capable of both contributing to and challenging military outcomes. Singapore became a catalyst for post-war reassessment, leading to more realistic planning, investment in intelligence, and an understanding of the importance of adaptability over rigid doctrine. Even decades later, the lessons of Singapore persisted in military thought. Officers studied the failure not as an isolated incident, but as a case study in the dangers of cognitive bias, strategic hubris, and flawed assumptions. Fortifications alone could not secure victory. Leadership, logistics, and understanding the enemy were paramount. The collapse of a seemingly impregnable fortress
illustrated that history is not kind to those who prepare for the last war rather than the one being fought.
Ultimately, Singapore's fall was a moment when theory met reality in the cruelest way. It was a stark reminder that in war, victory is never guaranteed by reputation, past successes, or sheer numbers. The Japanese had exploited speed, surprise, and ingenuity, while the British clung to outdated models and assumptions. And while the Empire's narrative of supremacy suffered a blow, the lessons learned paved the way for more effective strategies later in the war, informing Allied victories in Burma, the Pacific, and beyond. Singapore became a cautionary tale etched in both military history and human memory. A city that symbolized imperial confidence and invincibility had fallen, not to overwhelming force alone, but to a combination of misjudgment, underestimation, and the sheer adaptability of an enemy who refused to follow expected rules. For the men and women who survived, for the planners who studied its collapse, and for the world watching, Singapore was a stark, unforgettable lesson. In war, the greatest threat often comes not from what you see, but from what you refuse to imagine. By February 15, 1942, the reality in Singapore had become undeniable. Lieutenant General Arthur Percival sat in his command post at Fort Canning, staring at reports that all told the same grim story. The northwestern front had collapsed, Japanese forces were now pushing into the suburbs, and the city's water reservoirs were dangerously low. Ammunition dumps were burning, and the 15-inch coastal guns, once the pride of the fortress, were largely ineffective against infantry. Percival's chief engineer handed him a typed memo. Water supply to the city would fail within 24 hours. The reserves were insufficient for both military and civilian needs. Percival knew the situation was catastrophic. Any counterattack would require troops and resources that no longer existed. The Australian 22nd Brigade had been shattered. Indian divisions had broken. The British 18th Division, fresh off the boat, was already reduced by a third. There were no reserves, no tanks, no operational aircraft, and no water. Singapore's defenses, built for a sea assault, were now almost entirely irrelevant. The jungle, once considered impassable, had become the main conduit for the Japanese advance, exposing the flaws in decades of planning. The civilian population crowded onto the island faced panic and desperation. Hospitals overflowed, food supplies were insufficient, and looting became rampant in the streets. For 1 million civilians, the fortress meant nothing. They could no longer rely on the illusion of British invincibility. In every corner of the city, the collapse was visible. Australian soldiers watched Japanese tanks roll through plantations, British pilots were grounded for lack of fuel, and nurses at Alexandra Hospital witnessed waves of wounded arriving from defeated units. The myth of Singapore as impregnable was gone, shattered quietly, brutally, and completely. By mid-afternoon, Percival convened his final staff meeting. 3 options were presented: a counterattack to recapture the reservoirs, a withdrawal to a tight urban perimeter, or surrender. Each choice carried catastrophic consequences, but the first 2 were effectively impossible. The forces simply did not exist to mount a meaningful response. The staff understood the grim reality. The only viable option was surrender. At 5:15 p.m., Percival walked into the Ford factory at Bukit Timah to meet General Yamashita. The Japanese commander, despite his own exhausted troops and logistical strains, demanded unconditional surrender. Percival tried to negotiate, but the answer was simple: yes. 80,000 men, representing the largest capitulation in British military history, were surrendered in a single hour-long meeting. The fortress, once a symbol of imperial confidence, had fallen in 7 days. The collapse of Singapore was not simply a military failure. It was a structural, psychological, and strategic catastrophe. For 2 centuries, Britain had relied on the belief that its arms, organization, and willpower guaranteed global supremacy. Singapore's fall destroyed that assumption. If the British Empire could not hold this fortress, what could it protect? Across Asia, from India to New Zealand, the question reverberated: could Britain defend them? The answer, painfully clear, was no, not alone.
In Tokyo, Japanese celebrations framed the victory as proof of their superiority and the beginning of a new era free from Western domination. Propaganda reels showed Percival signing the surrender, and the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere was heralded as achievable. Across the Pacific, the collapse emboldened Japanese advances into Borneo, the Philippines, and New Guinea. For the prisoners, however, the war had only begun. 80,000 soldiers marched into captivity, facing forced labor, starvation, and disease, with more than a quarter never returning home.
The fall of Singapore would haunt military academies for decades. Officers from Sandhurst to West Point studied the campaign as a lesson in strategic blindness. Assumptions are not intelligence, fortifications are not strategy, and historical supremacy offers no guarantees. The British had prepared for the last war, not the next one. Confidence had turned into complacency, and complacency into catastrophe. In the end, Singapore proved a timeless lesson. Even the strongest fortress can become a trap when it faces the wrong enemy in the wrong way. The surrender of Singapore sent shockwaves far beyond the island itself. For decades, the British had believed in the invincibility of their military and the inevitability of their empire. Singapore's fall shattered that illusion overnight. Commanders in London, who had relied on reports that Singapore was impregnable, were forced to confront the bitter reality. The fortress had been designed for the wrong enemy, the wrong battlefield, and the wrong century. Confidence in British arms, once absolute, now faltered under the weight of failure. In the colonies, the psychological impact was immediate and profound. India, Burma, Malaya, and Australia watched in disbelief. Local populations who had once placed their faith in the Union Jack now questioned whether British promises of protection meant anything at all. The fall of a supposedly invincible fortress exposed a vulnerability that few had imagined, raising doubts about the empire's ability to defend its territories. For nationalist movements across Asia, Singapore's capitulation was proof that colonial authority could be challenged, a spark for political and military aspirations against Western control. Within the British military, morale plummeted. Officers trained in European warfare and steeped in assumptions of racial and technological superiority struggled to reconcile their expectations with reality. The Japanese, with their unconventional tactics, speed, and adaptability, had shattered centuries of military orthodoxy. Generals and strategists realized that doctrine and training alone could not prepare a force for an enemy willing to disregard the rules of conventional warfare. Mistakes in judgment, underestimation of the enemy, and reliance on outdated plans became glaringly obvious, leaving a legacy of professional embarrassment and deep self-reflection. Civilians on Singapore endured a nightmare. Refugees crowded streets and docks, scrambling for food, water, and passage off the island. Hospitals overflowed with the wounded and sick, their cries mingling with the roar of Japanese artillery and the crackle of fires consuming neighborhoods. The British had not anticipated a siege under such conditions. What was meant to be a fortress of protection had become a trap, exposing not only soldiers but civilians to unimaginable suffering. The lessons were immediate. Fortifications and artillery cannot compensate for poor planning, inadequate intelligence, or inflexible assumptions about the enemy. In Tokyo, the Japanese celebrated the fall as an unequivocal triumph, using it to boost morale and justify expansion across Southeast Asia. Newsreels depicted Percival signing the surrender, and propaganda glorified the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. The victory reinforced Japanese confidence in their military tactics and strategic vision, painting the empire as both dominant and unstoppable. Yet this confidence masked their own logistical difficulties, overextended supply lines, and the limits of maintaining control over newly captured territories, challenges that would only become more severe in the coming years.
On a personal level, Lieutenant General Percival and his staff bore the weight of historical scrutiny. Percival had faced impossible odds, commanding an ill-prepared and divided defense. The decisions made in those final days, to fight, to negotiate, to surrender, were not born of cowardice or incompetence, but of the stark reality that there were no alternatives.
His personal torment mirrored the collective shame of the British military hierarchy, which had assumed that strategic planning and fortifications could ensure victory without accounting for adaptability, innovation, and the unpredictability of a determined enemy. The fall of Singapore thus became a case study in the limits of doctrine and the dangers of overconfidence. It demonstrated that assumptions, when unchallenged, could be as deadly as enemy bullets. It highlighted the consequences of underestimating opponents, misreading terrain, and failing to adapt to unconventional tactics. And perhaps most profoundly, it underscored the human cost of strategic misjudgment. Tens of thousands of soldiers captured, a civilian population terrorized, and the psychological shock reverberating across an empire that had long believed itself invincible. The surrender of Singapore on February 15, 1942, marked not just a military defeat, but a turning point in global perception of power. For Britain, it was a humbling lesson. A century of assumed military and colonial supremacy could be undone in a single week when planning ignored reality. London reeled under the news. Prime Minister Churchill called it the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British history. And the phrase reverberated through military academies, policy meetings, and government corridors for years to come. The loss forced a painful reckoning. Strategy, training, and assumptions could not substitute for adaptability, intelligence, and respect for the enemy's ingenuity. The human cost was staggering. The 80,000 troops, British, Australian, Indian, and Malay, who had surrendered, were marched into captivity. Many were sent to labor camps and forced to build the infamous Burma Railway, enduring brutal conditions, malnutrition, and disease. More than a quarter of them would never return home. For civilians, the ordeal had only just begun. Those who survived the chaos of evacuation, looting, and the destruction of their city faced a new reality under Japanese occupation. Singapore's fall demonstrated the fragility of human security in wartime, particularly when defenses were designed more for prestige than practical defense. In military circles, Singapore became a case study in misjudgment. Officers analyzed how overconfidence, rigid doctrine, and reliance on outdated assumptions led to collapse. The lesson was clear. Fortifications alone do not guarantee safety. Understanding the enemy, flexibility in strategy, and preparation for unconventional tactics are critical. Singapore exposed the danger of underestimating any opponent, particularly one willing to innovate and exploit weakness. The myth of racial and technological superiority was permanently shattered, leaving a sobering awareness of vulnerability throughout the empire.
For Japan, the victory was a major psychological and strategic boost. Newsreels, propaganda, and celebrations reinforced the narrative of Japanese military supremacy. The conquest of Singapore fueled momentum across Southeast Asia, Burma, the Philippines, New Guinea, as the Japanese advanced rapidly, confident in their ability to dominate the region. The fall of a fortress that had been deemed impregnable validated their approach of speed, surprise, and ingenuity over brute force alone. It emboldened the empire's vision of the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, while signaling to the West that traditional assumptions of invincibility were no longer valid. Yet, even for Japan, the victory carried hidden challenges. The rapid territorial gains stretched supply lines, exposed vulnerabilities, and created logistical nightmares that would become increasingly difficult to manage as the war dragged on. The triumph, while celebrated, foreshadowed the limits of conquest over vast, diverse territories with populations hostile to occupation. In the decades that followed, the lessons of Singapore became integral to military education worldwide. Officers from Sandhurst to West Point studied the collapse, analyzing how flawed assumptions, rigid strategy, and underestimation of the enemy can turn a fortress into a tomb. Singapore taught that preparation for the last war is not preparation for the next one, that overconfidence can be fatal, and that in war, flexibility, intelligence, and respect for the enemy's capability are as important as firepower and fortifications. Ultimately,